In this video we want to talk about PESTEL, about environmental analysis and how environmental analysis impacts on the HRM function. So first of all, let's look at PESTEL in terms of its meaning. It starts with P for political, the political environment and how it would affect on HRM. Economic is the same, how it impacts on HRM. S for social, T for technological, L for legal, and E for environmental. So we want to see how each of these in turn will impact on the HRM function. So we'll start with the political. Environmental forces such as PESTEL have had the capability to change or affect the way human resources are managed. Clearly, human resources must respond to changes in the wider environment. So different trends in society, different pressures, different states of the economic condition of the society, the political influences and so on, all of these impact on the way in which HRM is conducted. In other words, the company does not operate in a vacuum. It operates in society, and the forces that affect society will affect the organization and must be taken into account by HRM. Changes within the external environment will have an impact on the labour market and the way organizations structure their people resources. So it's important for the organization to understand the wider environmental forces and understand how they will impact on the labour market, and therefore of course on how well the organisation is able to recruit, retain and improve their workforce. So the organisation must operate with all of these various forces impacting on it, albeit impacting on it indirectly, perhaps through the labour market. The economy is fast changing with constant threats from competitors worldwide. This will have an effect on employees and the type of jobs available. Over the last couple of decades, we have become accustomed to the process of globalization. Often this refers to the importation of cheap products, but perhaps good quality products, but cheap products coming from other countries. And these will have replaced domestic industry and domestic companies. So the labour force has been forced to change. The required skills have changed, and workers, employees have seen the need to update their skills and to become more flexible and so on in the context of this increased globalization. So there are many factors that impact on the organization which are truly outside of the influence of the organization. The organization has absolutely nothing to say about them because they are global perhaps, or there could be technological. Technological change happens because of innovations, because of discoveries, or because of inventions. And these are not, again, under any control from the company. The company cannot influence these. We accept the technology that's coming onto the market and we try to work with it. It's pointless in trying to fight it. The changing nature of work and culture in the UK poses new challenges for HRM. Now I say the UK, but in fact this applies to any society, in any country. And there is a changing nature of work. Even countries which are, let's say, further back in their development plans, countries in which workers are predominantly working in agriculture or in the extractive industries, those countries will be experiencing change because they may now be engaged in manufacturing, which will be a radical change for them. And in the West, we experience the change from manufacturing to services. There is a growing need to adopt employment contracts to meet the changing needs of the public. For example, the rise in zero-hour contracts and the need for flexibility. Well, we see much more pressure now in society to have flexibility in working. Perhaps there is more opportunities to work from home because of technology, or there is more understanding of the different needs from different parts of the workforce. Now, the zero-hour contract I referred to here is that the employers do not have a contract as such with the employees. They simply phone the employees when they want them. When the company experiences a surge in demand, it phones for the employees, and if the employees are available, they go to work for them, and in this way the workforce is more flexible. And it seems good to the organisation, but be wary, there are downsides to this. The employees, for example, will not have regular incomes. They've got bills to pay, they've got families to look after, and they may be sitting at home hoping to have a phone call to say they have got some work. So there are downsides to this development. Technology advancements have put manual labour at risk, with more jobs being occupied by machinery. We've seen the widespread introduction of robotics in, let's say, in car production, but it's not just car production anymore. It's the use of robotics in many parts of industry. Robots have a lot of advantages from the employer's perspective. The robots can work 24 hours a day, they work 7 days a week. The employer does not have the issues associated with motivation or having good leadership or whatever. The robots simply perform the functions. And as machines have become more sophisticated, and there's the introduction of computer-aided manufacturing and much more technology involved in the workplace, labour, humans, have found it difficult to compete with that. So again, there is growing pressure on the workforce to find niches in which they can produce better than technology. And it's the function of the HRM department to try to develop these skills, and where humans are required, they have pressures to update their skills, to improve their skill sets, to engage in education and development, and but at the same time give the employees flexibility and support. And so HRM has changed. HRM is a much bigger function and a much more sophisticated function than perhaps it was in the past. So if we look at the organisation, we can see pressures on the organisation. We can see, for example, political pressures. Now, or political factors. Changes to government policy and public sector spending cuts have had huge impacts on businesses, on employment levels, education funding, training provisions. The company exists in the country, in the society, and that society and the processes within the society will be largely determined by the government. The government will set out the routeway, the pathway that the society, in a sense, is going to follow. It'll do this through having economic policy and social policy and so on. And the government from time to time will adjust its budget. It'll adopt a fiscal policy, as we say. It'll adapt what it takes in taxation and what it spends, its fiscal policy, to meet certain political objectives. For example, some governments may wish to see a very small public sector. So they'll want to cut back on the role of the government in society and leave it to the private sector. Other governments will want to see a much more vigorous role for the government in the economy and will want to see the government expand its involvement in the economy. Whichever route is being followed, of course it'll have an impact on the organisation. It'll have an impact on all companies and industries. So clearly environmental factors are important. Changes to employment law, the rise of more flexible employment contracts, for example, the one I mentioned earlier, 0 hours and part-time and temporary and subcontracts and so on. The framework within which that takes place will be determined by the government. It will be enacted in law to give safeguards to the employees. But it will also give flexibility perhaps to the managers within companies. But again, it's the government that's setting those parameters. It's the government that's setting out that framework. So therefore, political factors are important in looking at the involvement of HRM with the employees in this context. The role of HRM has been expanded because there is a bigger recognition of the power of government and the influence of government on business life. And it's the HRM department that really, in a sense, is the interface between the two. It's the HRM that takes the rules and regulations set out by the government and implements them within the business. It's the HRM department that looks at the issues of government spending and taxation and so on, and looks at the course of the economy and looks at situations where perhaps the economy is contracting and more workers are about to be made redundant, and again, that's a role for the HRM department. So HRM is the connection between the organisation and the wider political environment. Lifting trade barriers means easier importing and exporting, increase in outsourcing and reduced business costs. And it's the government that negotiates trade barriers and lifting trade barriers, and it's the government that's involved with the World Trade Organization, and it deals directly with some countries and it negotiates tariffs and reductions in tariffs and tries to eliminate obstacles to trade. But this of course makes importing easier, which will make a much more competitive environment in which the organisation or the company may exist. And again, it's the HRM department who will have the pressures to ensure that the workforce have the right skills, the right training, the right remuneration, the right motivations, etc., to try and cope with the extra burden caused by more imports, more globalisation, and so on. There's also the economic. This overlaps, of course, with what I've just said. All of these areas, to some extent, overlap. But the economic one, well, economic conditions of a country play a key role on the labour market and job availability. I've just given the example of the government, say, cutting its involvement to some extent in the economy. The government may have a contracting fiscal policy, for example, contract the size of the government, restrict the size of the government, less government expending, and perhaps at the same time less taxation. So how does that work through the job market? Which parts of the job market are going to be affected? Well, the public sector may be cut back, for example, and the employees who leave the public sector will seek employment in the private sector. The UK is predominantly a service sector economy, which requires certain skill sets from the employers. Labour and industrial jobs have become harder to sustain due to outsourcing. Now, say the UK, but many countries are moving towards service sector a service sector base. And this does require certain skill sets from the employers as well as the employees. But the employers must be able to adjust from perhaps manufacturing over to services. If they know the market, because they were previously involved in manufacturing something, so they know that particular market, they may get involved with the service end of that market. It could be through marketing the product or distribution or retailing or wholesaling or whatever it is. But it's a new set of skills for the employers. There's also a new set of skills for the employees. If they're going to continue working for organizations like this, ones who are switching over from manufacturing to services, then clearly the employees must acquire a different set of skills. And they acquire those different set of skills from various sources, from the HRM department, training, updating, seminars, lectures, short courses. But they'll also perhaps acquire some skills from local colleges and from some vocational institutes that provide particular skills. So in a sense, there's a lot of updating to be done to accommodate changes in the economy. The strength of the UK economy determines business growth, hence the need for labour. I'll say again, the UK economy, well, this again applies to any economy. The strength of the economy determines business growth. If economies are strong, and let's say the economies are growing, then businesses, the chances are, will grow as well. Businesses will prosper. The markets are expanding. So the businesses will sell more and they'll be able to involve more employees and they just generally expand. So there'll be more labour required. So again, economic forces influences the organisation directly. And it means that there is a role for HRM in terms of training, contracts, motivation, specifying work routines, support for employees, and so on. There's also a socio-cultural dimension to organisations. Organisations exist in society. So whatever the processes in society, the chances are those processes will affect the organisation as well. Health and living standards have changed. There's a growing need for fitness and being health conscious. Business need to invest in welfare provision to support healthy living standards of their employees. There's much more emphasis now on lifestyle and work-life balance. And if a company is to maintain a good workforce, it must accommodate those requirements. And it does that through the provision of HRM services. The HRM department should be familiar with what is required and should make every effort to try and accommodate this, perhaps providing a gym on the site so that the employees, after working for a day, are able to go and work off the tensions of the day's work in a gym, or perhaps get membership of gyms outside, or negotiate concessions for their employees if they join clubs and societies outside of the workplace. But there is a social dimension, and whatever the trends in society are, the chances are these are going to be reflected in the requirements of the employees within the organisation. In terms of education, there is a growing interest in apprenticeships and preparing individuals for the world of work. Apprentices or apprenticeships were very popular at the end of the Second World War. It's the way that many skilled workers were trained. They applied to companies, generally speaking, let's say as young males, young males around, say, maybe the age of 15 or 16 or whatever, so something around that age. They would apply to a company, and if they were successful and the company took them on as an apprentice, they would then be assigned to a particular group of workers who would have responsibility for training that worker, that young worker, who would grow up in the company and acquire all the skills necessary to do the various tasks, and would understand the business and would understand the work routines and so on. Then it fell away and fell into disfavour, and there was more emphasis on higher education and degree study and diplomas and so on. And now it's coming back. There is a greater understanding the need for skills and need for this type of vocational training. So there is greater appreciation of this type of approach to employee development. And the HRM department is ideally suited to perhaps introduce apprenticeships or to introduce this type of learning within the workplace. Organisation culture and people's attitudes to work has developed the need for greater employment flexibility. This is it's a social trend. We recognise the importance for female workers who, let's say, have a baby, have a child, have a family. They have obligations. They have requirements outside of the workplace. Important requirements outside of the workplace. So if they're holding a job, they should have some sort of flexibility to enable them to balance these quite considerable pressures. And it's for the HR department to both understand the pressures on female workers, but also to understand the need for flexibility, and to try and devise work patterns which will enable the employees to hold down a job whilst at the same time meet, as I said, the not inconsiderable demands of trying to run a family. It also applies to the disabled. Accommodating disabled workers is an issue. Perhaps the doors would have to be changed in the offices, or some provision made to have disabled workers. But in a world in which the technology has changed so significantly and has changed towards being more suitable towards for disabled workers, this is not that onerous anymore. But it's for the HRM department to see this. There are various groupings, there are other groupings in society that should be accommodated in the same way. And it's important that the HRM department ensure that people employed within the organisation do not encounter any adverse reaction from other employees or from management in the form of discrimination, abuse, harassment, mistreatment of any sort. And it should be based on all sorts of factors: gender, sexual orientation, disability, age, and so on. And it's for the HRM department to ensure that that is the case. Technological. Well, the internet has developed new approaches to business. For example, e-commerce, e-business. There's much more information available now about markets and about products. Customers are able to check availability of products, prices, are able to request delivery directly to their home. They're able to do home shopping. The internet has revolutionized the amount of information and the contact between the employee, sorry, between the customer, I beg your pardon, between the customer and the organization. And it's important that organizations adjust to the reality of what is the predominant technology in our society. The organizations have to adapt to this and perhaps make facilities available online and ensure a good service to perhaps online customers. Well, this means, again, training, exposure to this type of activity, and ensuring that the organization is suitable to meet this challenge. Again, a job for the HRM department through training and acculturation and seminars and work programs and so on. Technology has opened doors for efficient global communications. Again, HRM needs to make sure that the skills are in place to capitalize on this development. But we live in a globalized society. We're very much aware of what happens right around the world because of very advanced communications technologies. But we're also aware of what competitors are doing in companies around the world and what products are developed around the world, what products are being introduced into markets and are being successful, and who are the market leaders and so on. So there is a more understanding of the market and what's required within the market, and it's important that the HRM section, in conjunction with the marketing section perhaps, understand the types of skills and the types of approaches that are needed, and make sure that the right personnel are recruited and trained to enable the organisation to avail of these trends and to use the trends to their advantage. Ergonomics has made the working environment more efficient. Development of machinery which work alongside workers to enhance productivity. We talked earlier about robotics and the issue associated with robotics. Well, this applies all the way through the organisation, from the offices where they're using dedicated software packages to do very specialized work that in the past perhaps would have to be outsourced to specialists. Now it can be done by the organization. But there are also routines within perhaps the shop floor or between on the manufacturing front, where specialist machines can be brought in and computer-aided manufacturing techniques applied, and the machines produce items to a very high quality and to very fine tolerances, and they facilitate the work routines. The workers are able to interface with the machines, and the output at the end is both efficient and perhaps to even a higher standard or a more consistent standard than could be achieved in the past. The legal framework. Well, legal requirements regarding health and safety legislation and the implementation of welfare provisions. Companies must follow the law, and over the years governments have introduced legislation to regulate working conditions, to make sure the working conditions are safe and they're conducive to a good environment in which the employees should spend their working days. So to ensure that legal provisions are adhered to falls with the HRM department. It's the HRM department who oversee this and ensure that this important function is fulfilled. Changes to employment contracts and the need for greater employee flexibility. Well, employment contracts can be upheld in law. So when the organisation is looking for more flexibility, there has to be adjustments to the employment contracts. And it's important that the contracts that are issued, which will give the organisation more flexibility, is not disadvantageous or grossly disadvantageous to the employee. The employee should not be punished severely by the introduction of flexible working practices. So it's really a situation which has to be managed and perhaps negotiated through collective bargaining, perhaps negotiated with trade union representatives as to how it's introduced, and it should be done on the basis of consensus, of agreement between the various parties. And in that way, there is no legal issue, perhaps. The impact on the European Union movement and the consequences of the UK leaving the EU. Well, this is a UK specific point. It doesn't apply to many countries throughout the world, obviously. But the European Union is a trading bloc. A trading bloc means they are trying to remove obstacles to trade throughout the European Union. But the European Union has become more ambitious. They've now got their own currency, the euro. But they've also aimed at really bringing all of the economic and to some extent the political and the social legislation of countries under one umbrella, under the European Union. So in effect, it's becoming very similar to America. The federal government in America operates at the highest level, and the state governments operate under it. Well, some people in some countries, for example in the UK, they have reservations about this. The UK has got a long history of independent thinking and a long history of independence, indeed. And it's very difficult for many people to give up this and join an organisation and be a small player in a big organisation. The UK has always gone its own way and has in many areas led the world, not just from the Industrial Revolution but to great thinkers in philosophy, in the arts, in science and in politics. And the UK has been through a lot in its history, so many people within the UK, as I said, are reticent about joining a single entity and becoming one part of that single entity. So there is a debate, and it seems to be an ongoing debate in the UK about as to whether the UK should be a member of the European Union or not, or perhaps it should be just an associated member of the European Union and maintain its independence. Clearly, in a talk of this nature, we can't decide anything, or I can't suggest which way this debate is going to turn out. But it's ongoing, and it's likely to remain ongoing, irrespective of the results of referenda or political discussions or whatever. In years to come, it'll probably still be debated. Environmental. The growing concern on pollution levels and global warming has put pressures on organisations to be more ethical and reduce their carbon footprint. This has to be tempered in a way as well. We know that we live on a small planet going round the local sun. It's a very small planet, and we have a lot of population on the planet, and the population is getting bigger by the second. And all of the people on the planet want a good lifestyle, so we need a lot of resources. And unfortunately, because the planet is so small, given our numbers, there is pressure on resources. But we also live out lifestyles which pollute the air we breathe and has influenced the weather on the planet and is now starting to lead to rising sea levels because the planet is starting to warm up, and the polar caps are starting to melt, so sea levels are rising. Some countries with very large populations still rely on energy from coal, for example. So they want to burn coal, but that will make the planet worse. And to people who have very little, it makes very little difference. They just need energy. They need electricity. They need lights at night and the very basics in life. And if they don't have coal to burn to make the electricity, their lifestyles will be a lot worse. On the other hand, if they do burn the coal, the planet will certainly be doomed. Now, I don't know what the answer is to this one. It's a big issue. It needs to be properly debated and properly considered. It is an extremely complex issue. But some governments simply say that they need the energy, so therefore they need to burn coal, a fossil fuel. And as they burn the coal, of course, they're going to put more pressure on the atmosphere, and the climate will change considerably, affecting the whole planet. Governments have placed more emphasis on recycling. The UK government now imposes tax on the use of plastic shopping bags. It might seem a small point, but it's symptomatic of the way in which consumers have become aware of the needs for more ethical and more responsive treatment of the planet. Plastic bags in shopping were everywhere. They were used once to carry some groceries back from the shop, and then they were thrown away. But the plastic bags had to be made, using up the Earth's resources. They have to be disposed of, and plastic bags do not degrade. They degrade over, apparently they do degrade, but it's over hundreds of years or some very long figure. So the government imposed a tax on the use of plastic bags, which means now in the UK when people go shopping they take reusable bags with them to take home their groceries, which is much more logical. But more importantly, will make some contribution to saving the planet. And the way to save the planet is probably through lots of these type of small initiatives. Changes in legislation to ensure fuel emissions have been reduced, and corporations are taking part in social corporate responsibility. Well, we try to have cars which are more efficient in using fuel and stop emissions from the cars which are dangerous and will affect the atmosphere. But then again, as I said earlier, some countries will burn coal and will burn millions of tons of coal every year, which will significantly cause a deterioration in the climate and a deterioration in our quality of life globally, so that innocent people on the other side of the world will be affected by the actions of some governments. But there again, if those governments have significant proportions of their population who are poor and need energy and need the resource, it's difficult to tell them not to do it. But if they do it, then innocent people living in other countries will be affected. It's a really complicated issue, and it's one worth considering in more detail, perhaps elsewhere. But that's all I'm going to deal with in this talk on environmental analysis, and in particular in the context of HRM. So let's leave it at that and say thank you for watching.